The first light of dawn crept over Vicksburg, settling on the white columns of the Lafayette mansion like a thin veil of judgment. It was too quiet for a house of that size, too still for a place where footsteps, whispers, and the friction of tension usually filled every hallway. On this morning, however, silence clung like humidity, thick, alert, and waiting. The townspeople scattered across the sloping streets leading down to the river had already begun to talk. Something had happened at the Lafayette estate, something none of them were prepared to name aloud. The mansion itself carried the weight of a past that had never been cleaned away, no matter how many coats of fresh paint were slapped on its exterior. Inside, the relics of fading wealth stood like ghosts attempting to remind anyone who entered that the Lafayettes still mattered. Gilded frames, French furniture, heavy drapes imported long before the war. Everything suggested grandeur, and yet the air in each room trembled with the faint sense of decline. The echo of steps on the wooden floors felt hollow, the rooms felt larger than they should, and the over-polished surfaces reflected a family trying too hard to preserve an illusion. By 7 o'clock the servants had begun their routines, but their movements carried an edge. Hesitation, glances exchanged too quickly, breaths held for too long. Something in their posture told a story few dared to articulate. Among them was the man at the center of every unspoken tension. Isaac. Tall, deliberate, with eyes that rarely revealed more than he intended. Isaac moved through the mansion with a kind of controlled awareness, as if he was quietly measuring every inch of the place he had served for over a decade. His expression remained calm, but there was a stillness in him that suggested something deeper, something coiled. Isaac's presence was known but rarely acknowledged by the Lafayettes beyond what civility required. He had been part of the household long enough to witness the family's triumphs, its humiliations, its decay. He had seen the patriarch, Charles Lafayette, transform from a man of booming confidence to one haunted by debts he pretended did not exist. He had watched Margaret Lafayette polish every detail of her reputation while ignoring the rot beneath her own roof. He had observed the children, Evelyn with her simmering bitterness, Thomas with his restless, reckless pride, drift further from their parents and closer to their own ruin. Every day that Isaac walked these halls, he absorbed their secrets. Some were whispered in drunken arguments, others spilled accidentally in moments of crisis, and still others were delivered directly to him by those who had no one else to confide in. Over time, he had become the silent archive of the Lafayette family's truth, the keeper of everything they thought they had hidden from him. This morning, he stood in the corridor near the grand staircase, cloth in hand, polishing the banister with a motion so steady it bordered on hypnotic. The early sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, pale stripes over the floorboards. Isaac paused for a moment, listening. The house breathed faintly, timber settling, a door far away shifting with the draft, the soft footsteps of other servants beginning their tasks. But beneath those ordinary sounds, there was something else, something Isaac recognized. It was the sound of a household bracing itself. Evelyn Lafayette was the first family member to appear. Dressed in a mourning robe far too elegant for the hour, she descended the stairs with the irritated grace of someone accustomed to being observed. Her hair was pinned too tightly, her jaw set too firmly. She glanced at Isaac only long enough to acknowledge that he was exactly where he always was. Yet something about her expression betrayed a restless night. "Has breakfast been prepared?" she asked, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Yes, ma'am," Isaac replied, his tone careful, neutral. He lowered his eyes only slightly, not enough to appear submissive, but enough to maintain the balance expected of him. Behind her on the landing, Thomas appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes and muttering under his breath. He looked hungover. Again, their presence together only deepened the sense that something in the household was misaligned. As the siblings continued down the stairs, Isaac resumed his task. Yet his fingers pressed more firmly around the cloth, as if grounding himself. The mansion's hush grew heavier, like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. At the far end of the hallway, near the parlor doors, a shadow shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Isaac's gaze flicked toward it for just a fraction of a second. Someone else was awake earlier than expected. and whoever it was watching. The mansion had not always felt like a cage. Years earlier, before the war hollowed out every fortune in Vicksburg, before pride and desperation fused into something poisonous, the Lafayette home had been a monument to ambition. Guests used to gather on the wraparound porch during humid summers, sipping sweet tea and praising Charles Lafayette for his charm and his unshakable vision. Margaret, in her pearl-trimmed gowns, floated through conversations like a queen presiding over a court she believed eternal. But time had a way of stripping illusions bare, and Isaac had been there long enough to witness every stage of the unraveling. It began with Charles returning from New Orleans with the edge of defeat in his eyes. No one else noticed then. Not the family, not the guests. But Isaac saw it. He saw the way Charles's hands trembled after reading certain letters. He saw the way Margaret began locking drawers more frequently. He saw the quiet arguments behind half-closed doors late at night, muffled but unmistakably bitter. Back then, Isaac moved through the household with the obedient silence expected of him, but his mind was always cataloging details, collecting fragments. A ledger left open on a desk. A heated whisper between siblings near the kitchen entrance. The smell of whiskey drifting down the hall when it shouldn't. The minutiae of decline. Years passed, tensions thickened, and the Lafayette children grew into versions of themselves shaped by a decaying dynasty. Evelyn, once timid, developed a hard, polished exterior. Sharp words, sharper expectations. She walked as though every step had to uphold the family name, even when the name itself was collapsing from within. To her, Isaac was a fixture, something between a shadow and a tool, always present, rarely acknowledged, but inevitably relied upon. Thomas, on the other hand, took after his father, restless, reckless, hungry for validation. He sought control where he could find it, even in the smallest displays of power. More than once, Isaac had quietly stepped between Thomas's drunken impulses and a servant who didn't have time to dodge. More than once, Thomas had muttered apologies the next morning, half-hearted and half-forgotten. But the household dynamic shifted entirely on an evening 2 years earlier, a moment so small that none of the Lafayette family remembered it, but Isaac never forgot. That night, rain hammered the windows. The lamps flickered. Charles had been pacing his study like a man confronting his last options. Margaret was upstairs, ignoring him. The children were out, leaving the house eerily hollow. Isaac entered quietly to deliver correspondence that had arrived late. Charles snatched the envelope with trembling fingers, tore it open, read the contents, and something inside him broke. The letter slipped from his hand to the floor. His pride, his legacy, his carefully constructed identity, all of it seemed to drain from his posture. He sank into his chair and spoke aloud, not to Isaac, but simply into the room. "They'll take everything," he whispered. "Everything my father built. Everything I kept alive." Isaac stood still, unsure whether to leave or acknowledge the confession. But Charles wasn't talking to him. He wasn't talking to anyone. For the first time, Isaac saw the patriarch not as a tyrant or a master, but as a frightened man trapped by the weight of his own decisions. Something shifted inside Isaac then. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, but understanding. The family believed themselves untouchable, but they were human, vulnerable, cracked. And cracks, when widened, could bring down entire structures. Over the following months, Isaac observed as desperation drove Charles to take increasingly reckless actions, misplaced trust, hidden deals, unpaid debts. Margaret responded by tightening her social mask, hosting gatherings she could no longer afford and enforcing politeness like a form of warfare. Evelyn grew colder, Thomas wilder. The household began running less on order and more on fear disguised as routine. And Isaac learned. He learned the patterns of each family member, their insecurities, their contradictions, their darkest impulses. He learned where the mansion creaked and where it stayed silent, which doors stuck, which windows didn't lock properly, who lied with confidence and who avoided looking others in the eye. He didn't plan anything then, not consciously, but knowledge has a way of fermenting, ripening, preparing itself. And by the time 1874 had settled over Vicksburg, Isaac knew more about the Lafayette family than any one of them knew about themselves. On a late afternoon that year, Thomas confronted his father in the study. Voices rose, sharp and panicked. Words like debts, reputation, and ruin echoed down the corridor. Isaac, dusting the parlor doorway, paused. Not visibly, not long, but just enough. The confrontation ended abruptly with a crash, glass shattering against the fireplace. But it was the aftermath Isaac noticed most. The door to the study, left slightly ajar, revealed Charles slumped in his chair, face hidden in his hands, and Thomas standing rigid, jaw clenched, his eyes flicking, not at his father, but directly toward the corridor, toward Isaac, as though he sensed something, as though he feared something. For the first time, someone in the Lafayette family looked at Isaac not as a servant, but as a threat, a realization that came far too late. The tension inside the Lafayette mansion had become a living thing, unseen yet unmistakable, drifting through the hallways like a cold draft no one could quite identify. By the spring of 1874, every member of the family walked as though the floorboards beneath them might give way at any moment. And Isaac, moving silently through their crumbling world, felt the shift like a slow tightening around the ribs. Vicksburg itself reflected the same uneasy energy. The town was rebuilding after the war, trying to reinvent its dignity while grappling with its ghosts. Streets once filled with Confederate pride now housed men with vacant eyes and pockets empty of promises. Women whispered in church pews about debts, alliances, and sins resurfacing like driftwood after a storm. Respectability was a thin curtain everyone clung to. The Lafayette name still carried weight, but that weight was now brittle, ready to crack. Inside the mansion, the decline was impossible to ignore. Supplies arrived later each month. Servants whispered about wages slipping. Margaret tightened rules, forcing composure where the foundation was already fractured. Every morning, she descended the stairs with the stiff poise of someone holding her breath, afraid that exhaling would shatter everything. Charles, meanwhile, had begun locking himself in the study for hours, staring at ledger books filled with numbers that no longer made sense. The house echoed with his frustration. Drawers slammed shut, ink splattering across documents, the faint thud of his fist against the desk. Some nights he skipped dinner entirely. Others he drank quietly, his silhouette flickering through the frosted glass as he paced back and forth, pacing as if circling a decision too heavy to lift. Isaac watched it all, not out of malice or curiosity, but out of inevitability. His awareness had grown sharper, more pointed. He no longer simply noticed things. He analyzed them, let them settle into place like pieces of a slow-moving puzzle. But it wasn't until Evelyn's behavior began to shift that Isaac sensed true danger. Evelyn, always composed to the point of cruelty, had become jumpy. She flinched at unexpected noises. She snapped at servants for the slightest perceived mistake. And she was hiding something. Isaac could see the tremor in her hands when she believed no one was watching. Late one evening, Isaac passed by the closed doors of her room and heard muffled sobbing. Not grief, fear, raw fear. The kind a person tries to swallow before it exposes the truth. The next day, Evelyn appeared at breakfast pale and agitated. Margaret asked no questions. She avoided vulnerability the way some avoided fire, but the absence of inquiry only deepened the unease. Isaac continued his duties with quiet precision, yet every passing hour brought some new sign that the Lafayette household was approaching a breaking point. Then came the afternoon Thomas returned home early, disheveled, sweating, reeking of whiskey and anger. He stormed through the parlor, his boots striking the floor with the impatience of a man cornered. Isaac had just set a vase upright on the mantel when Thomas entered, but he didn't notice Isaac at first. He was too consumed by his own spiraling frustration. "I'm warning you," Thomas muttered to himself, or perhaps to someone recently encountered. "I'm not letting this happen. I'm not letting them destroy us." Isaac stepped back into the shadow between the tall windows. It wasn't fear that made him retreat. It was clarity. Thomas was unraveling. When Thomas finally saw Isaac, he hesitated. His eyes flickered with recognition, followed by resentment, then something colder. as if he had suddenly become aware that Isaac had witnessed far too much. "You hear everything in this house?" Thomas said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. His words slurred slightly, though his expression was lucid. Isaac responded with a quiet, steady, "Only what is spoken aloud, sir." Thomas stepped closer, invading the space between them, his breath thick with liquor. "You think you understand us," he whispered. "You don't." But Isaac said nothing because silence was more powerful than argument. The moment hung between them like the humidity before a storm. Thomas finally stepped back, but the way he watched Isaac suggested a new fear had rooted itself in him. It was later that same night when the most unsettling shift occurred. The servants were retiring, the lamps dimming, the household settling into uneasy rest. Isaac walked the upstairs hall, checking windows and extinguishing the last of the lights. As he turned the corner, he saw Evelyn standing at the end of the corridor, half hidden by shadow. She wasn't moving. She wasn't speaking. She was simply watching him. Her eyes, usually sharp, polished, full of superiority, were now wide with something else entirely. Not suspicion, not authority, recognition. As though she too finally understood that the balance of power inside the Lafayette mansion had begun to tilt. Isaac paused, just long enough for their eyes to lock. Then Evelyn stepped backward into the darkness and shut her door without a single word. The hall fell silent again, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was an omen. Night in Vicksburg had a particular stillness, one shaped by humid air, distant river sounds, and the lingering wounds of a town forced to reinvent itself. But on the night that settled over the Lafayette mansion, the stillness felt different. It stretched too far, held too tightly, as if the very walls were waiting to exhale. The household moved through the evening like actors performing roles they no longer believed in. Dinner passed in stiff silence. Charles picked at his food, eyes sunken and glassy. Margaret kept her spine rigid, pretending not to notice the tremor in her husband's hands or the way Thomas avoided looking at anyone for more than a second. Evelyn sat across from them, jaw clenched, staring down at her plate as though she feared that lifting her gaze would reveal something she didn't want to acknowledge. Isaac served each dish with mechanical precision. He was the only constant presence in the room, unmoving, unshaken, observing every detail the family tried so desperately to conceal. When he stood behind Margaret's chair, he could see the sheen of sweat on Charles's temple. When he stepped to Evelyn's side, he noticed the slight twitch in her fingers. When he passed behind Thomas, he caught the smell of desperation beneath the whiskey, sharp, acidic, unmistakable. It was a dinner shared by people who were no longer connected, only bound by the fear of collapse. After the meal, the family dispersed like scattered pieces of a broken mirror. Margaret retreated to the parlor, pretending to read. Charles disappeared into his study, locking the door with more urgency than usual. Evelyn went upstairs without a word. Thomas wandered outside, pacing the veranda with an agitation that bordered on frantic. Isaac extinguished lamps, collected dishes, and reset the house with the same quiet discipline as always. But he felt something tightening around the night, a sensation not of threat, but of inevitability. He stepped out to the back porch to empty the wash basin and found Thomas leaning against a post, staring into the darkness. The moon cast a pale glow across his face, illuminating anger, fear, and something else, something hollow. "They're lying to me," Thomas muttered, his voice too quiet to be addressed to anyone but himself. "Everyone, even my father." Isaac didn't move. He simply waited, knowing the young man wasn't finished. Thomas gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. "Do you know what happens when a family's reputation collapses? When people start to whisper?" He turned sharply toward Isaac. "Do you?" Isaac met his gaze without flinching. "Whispers don't ruin families, sir. Truth does." Thomas inhaled sharply, startled by the boldness of the response, not its words, but the calm certainty behind them. For a moment he looked ready to lash out. But instead, he stumbled backward, shaking his head as if trying to clear it, then stormed inside. Isaac watched him go, his expression unreadable. The moon hung low. The air thickened. And inside the mansion, the night deepened into something uneasy. Hours later, when most of the household had retreated to their rooms, Isaac remained awake, moving through the mansion with slow, deliberate steps. He checked the windows, the doors, the locks, tasks assigned to him long ago, though tonight they felt like something more, something intentional. He paused outside the study door. Light glowed beneath it. Charles was still awake. A faint sound emerged from inside, papers shuffling, drawers opening, a frustrated sigh. Isaac listened, not out of curiosity, but because the noise carried a shape he recognized. A man coming undone. Inside the study, Charles Lafayette stood over his desk, surrounded by unpaid bills, threatening letters, and records he had tried for months to hide. He looked older than his age, worn down by the weight of secrets he knew were no longer containable. He poured himself a drink with shaking fingers, and then, quite unexpectedly, he whispered a name. Isaac. Just that, barely audible, but the sound carried through the door all the same. Isaac froze. He wasn't sure whether Charles was speaking to him, about him, or merely voicing the name of the person who had witnessed his downfall with the quiet clarity no other member of the household possessed. Either way, the moment marked a shift, a recognition long overdue. Isaac stepped back, slowly, and moved down the corridor. His footsteps made no sound. Upstairs, Evelyn stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the dark front lawn. She had not slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture rigid. She pressed a trembling hand against the glass as though trying to steady her breath. She saw Isaac below, crossing the hallway, calm, measured, purposeful, and for the first time she understood what her fear had been trying to tell her. This house was no longer under her family's control. Someone else was steering the night, someone who did not tremble. A draft swept through the hallway, cold and sudden, making the lamps flicker. Somewhere inside the mansion, a door clicked shut. Softly, decisively, as though the night had just chosen a direction of its own. The night had settled fully over the Lafayette mansion, thick as molasses and twice as suffocating. Every lamp seemed to flicker, every shadow stretched farther than it should. And Isaac, moving through the hallways with a presence both silent and deliberate, felt the moment he had long understood finally arrive. Quiet, patient, inescapable. This was the night the Lafayette dynasty would break. Inside the study, Charles slumped over his desk, surrounded by the ghosts of his own failures. The letters demanding payment, the threats, the notes he had written and crumpled, scattered across the floor like discarded pleas. A man once feared and respected was now shrinking into the confines of his own despair. He reached for his glass again, but his hand trembled too violently to lift it. A sudden knock, gentle, measured, made him flinch. "Who's there?" His voice cracked from exhaustion. No answer. Charles rose unsteadily, crossed the room and opened the door just enough to peer into the hallway, but found only emptiness. Or so it seemed. The corridor breathed with a stillness that felt wrong. The lamps along the wall dimmed in a single wavering pulse. Charles shut the door, turning the lock with a decisiveness born of fear rather than caution. He leaned against it, eyes closed, unaware that across the mansion, the same quiet unease crept into every room. Upstairs, Evelyn moved back from her window, pacing her bedroom like an animal sensing a predator. She pressed her hand to her chest, breath shallow. She tried to steady herself with reason. Isaac is only a servant. Isaac has always been obedient. Isaac has no reason to harm us, but the words tasted false. She had seen something in his eyes that morning, something she had not recognized. Not anger, not resentment. Control. Meanwhile, Margaret sat alone in the parlor, posture rigid, fingers clamped around the armrest of her chair. She refused to acknowledge the dread pooling in her stomach. The Lafayette name could not break, not under her watch. She repeated that to herself like a prayer. Yet even she noticed the strange quiet, the way the house no longer felt like hers. And outside, on the porch, Thomas paced the boards with frantic, uneven steps. Sweat glistened on his temples despite the cool night air. His thoughts churned, tangled in liquor and fear. He kept glancing toward the windows as though expecting something, someone, to appear behind them. But the person he feared was already inside. Isaac moved through the first floor with calm purpose. He checked the locks not as a dutiful servant but as someone marking boundaries, closing escape routes, sealing the night. His footsteps were nearly soundless, but the house felt each one like a shift in gravity. He passed the parlor. Margaret didn't see him, but she felt the air behind her stir. Her spine straightened, breath-catching. She turned her head slowly, but the doorway was empty. He ascended the stairs. Evelyn heard the faint creak and froze mid-step, eyes wide. She clutched the edge of her dresser, knuckles whitening. For a long moment she did not move, could not move. Thomas, coming inside from the porch, found the foyer dimmer than before, colder. He called out for Isaac, intending to demand whiskey, but the mansion answered with silence. A silence so deep it felt like a warning. The storm inside each room finally converged at the heart of the house. In the hallway near the staircase, the Lafayette family confronted one another, not by choice but by gravity. Margaret stood rigid, face pale. Thomas appeared from the shadows, wild-eyed. Evelyn descended the stairs slowly, trembling. They looked like strangers sharing a nightmare. And from the far end of the hall, Isaac stepped forward, not threatening, not fearful, simply present. A man who had served this house for more than a decade. A man who had watched their cruelty, their arrogance, their slow disintegration. A man who knew every secret they had whispered, every lie they had buried, every sin they had hoped the darkness would keep hidden. Charles emerged from the study at last, unsteady, confused, and when he saw Isaac standing before his family, something in his face collapsed. Recognition, understanding. Too late. "Isaac," he whispered, voice cracking with dread. Isaac's expression did not shift. His voice was quiet, controlled, inevitable. "This house," he said, "has reached its end." The words struck the family like a blow, not because they were loud, but because they were true, spoken aloud for the first time. The lamps flickered once more, shadows stretching like dark fingers across the walls. A gust of cold air swept through the corridor, making every flame tremble. And in the heavy silence that followed, each Lafayette felt the same chilling realization. The night no longer belonged to them. It never had. A distant door creaked open, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house like a final verdict. Isaac turned his head slightly, listening. And the Lafayette family understood, with a fear that hollowed them from the inside, that whatever happened next was already in motion, already decided, already unavoidable. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to leave a comment telling us which part shocked you the most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves dark American history as much as you do. Your support helps us bring more hidden stories, forgotten scandals, and chilling secrets from the past to life. See you in the next story.